In the idyllic English countryside stands Elderflower House, where the gardens are immaculate and the secrets are venomous. When the wealthy tyrant Sir Alistair Finch is found dead, poisoned by a flower from his own prize-winning collection, a web of deception begins to unravel. Chapter 1. An invitation to the country. The village of Little Hembury nestled in its valley as if placed there by a gentle hand. A picture postcard collection of thatched roofs, a Norman church tower, and a meandering stream that glittered like a silver ribbon. It was the sort of place that prided itself on its tranquillity, where the loudest sound was often the drone of a bee in the vicarage roses, or the cheerful clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Yet beneath this placid surface, the currents of human nature ran as deep and often as dark as anywhere else, a fact Miss Jane Marple understood with unwavering certainty. She was visiting her nephew, the rather successful novelist Raymond West, and his dear wife Joan. Their modern, architect-designed house, a stark statement of glass and clean lines, stood in some contrast to the village's prevailing aesthetic, yet it afforded magnificent views of the rolling countryside. It was from this vantage point, seated in a surprisingly comfortable, if angular, armchair, with her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm, that Miss Marple first heard the name that would soon be on everyone's lips. Sir Alistair Finch, Raymond announced, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with an air of theatrical contemplation. A perfect specimen of the English country tyrant, rich as Croesus, temper of a hornet, and the proprietor of the finest botanical gardens in the county. We're all invited to his annual garden party on Saturday. Joan, a painter with a practical soul and a fondness for her husband's dramatic pronouncements, added, "Don't let Raymond put you off, Aunt Jane." The gardens at Elderflower House are truly a sight to behold. And Lady Finch, Beatrice, is a friend of mine. She's much younger than Sir Alistair, and, well, she does her best. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "Does her best at what, my dear?" she asked, her voice mild. Joan hesitated, choosing her words with the care of one navigating a delicate social situation. "At being the lady of the manor. It can't be easy. Sir Alistair is particular. He purchased Elderflower House about 10 years ago, and has poured a fortune into it, especially the gardens. It's his life's work, his obsession, some might say." "And his family?" Miss Marple inquired, her gaze fixed on a complex loop of wool. "One imagines a man of such standing has a family." "Oh, yes," Raymond chimed in, eager to sketch the characters for his aunt's benefit, much as he would for a reader. "There's the heir, Julian, son from the first wife, who passed away years ago. Julian is the brooding, resentful type. Works in the city, something to do with stocks, but he's always short of funds. He and his father, they say, communicate mostly through solicitors. He'll be down for the party, of course. Can't miss the annual performance of Filial Duty." "And there's Eleanor Vance," Joan added. "A cousin of some sort, a poor relation who acts as a companion to Beatrice. A very quiet, mousy little woman. You hardly notice she's there. She's been at Elderflower House for years, even before Beatrice arrived." Miss Marple absorbed these details, sorting them into the vast and intricate filing system of human behavior she kept in her mind. The overbearing patriarch, the young wife, the resentful son, the overlooked companion. It was a pattern not dissimilar to the troubles that had befallen the Pargeters in St. Mary Mead, though in that case the issue had been a disputed will and a prize-winning marrow. "It sounds like a most interesting gathering," she commented, her needles resuming their soft, rhythmic clicking. The day of the garden party arrived under a sky of brilliant, unblemished blue. Elderflower House, viewed from the end of its long, sweeping gravel drive, was a handsome Jacobean manor of warm, honey-coloured stone, draped in wisteria that was just beginning to shed its lavender blossoms. But it was the gardens that truly took one's breath away. They were a masterpiece of design, a series of interconnected rooms, a formal rose garden, a tranquil water garden with a Japanese bridge, a riotous herbaceous border, and most famously, the Arboretum, where Sir Alistair cultivated rare and exotic specimens from across the globe. Their host, Sir Alistair Finch, stood on the main lawn to greet his guests. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair that seemed to bristle with energy, and a face set in lines of permanent dissatisfaction. His eyes, a piercing blue, missed nothing. He shook Raymond's hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, nodded curtly at Joan, and gave Miss Marple a cursory glance, dismissing her as just another elderly aunt. "West, good of you to come," he boomed, his voice carrying across the lawn. "Beatrice is over by the marquee. See that you get some champagne." It was a command, not an invitation. Lady Finch, Beatrice, was indeed a vision. Dressed in a floaty pale yellow dress that complemented her blonde hair, she moved among her guests with a practised grace. But a close observer might have noticed the faint, strained line of her smile, and the way her eyes darted nervously towards her husband. She greeted Joan with genuine warmth, a brief respite from her duties. "Joan, so lovely to see you, and this must be your aunt, Miss Marple." Her handshake was cool and delicate. "Welcome to our home." As they spoke, a young man with a sullen expression and his father's sharp blue eyes approached them. This, Miss Marple deduced, could only be Julian Finch. He held a glass of champagne as if it were a weapon, and his gaze swept over the assembled crowd with a look of weary disdain. "Mother is asking for you, Beatrice," he said, his tone clipped. He barely acknowledged Joan and her aunt. "She says the caterers have forgotten the lemon for the salmon." "Of course, Julian." Beatrice's smile tightened further. "If you'll excuse me." She hurried away towards the house, a graceful ship sailing into troubled waters. Julian watched her go, a faint sneer on his lips. He then turned his attention to the gardens. Quite the performance, isn't it? Father's annual tribute to himself. Every plant perfectly placed, every petal in order. God forbid a weed should have the audacity to show its face. Miss Marple, who had been observing this little interchange with quiet interest, remarked, "A garden requires a great deal of effort. Your father must be a very dedicated man." Julian's gaze fell upon her, and for a moment his mask of cynicism slipped. "Dedicated? That's a polite word for it, madam. He's a fanatic. He cares more for his wretched plants than for any person. He'd sooner see me wither on the vine than one of his precious orchids." The bitterness in his voice was as potent as any poison. He seemed to catch himself, gave a stiff little bow, and melted back into the crowd. Later, while Joan and Raymond were engaged in conversation with the local vicar, Miss Marple took a gentle stroll by herself. Her path led her away from the main lawn, towards a more secluded part of the garden, near a high stone wall. Here the planting was denser, the atmosphere more shadowed and mysterious. It was, she learned from a small, neatly painted sign, the entrance to the Physic Garden, where Sir Alistair grew plants known for their medicinal and sometimes more dangerous properties. A man was on his knees by a bed of what looked to be rather uninteresting green herbs, tending to them with a lover's care. He had the weathered face and soil-stained hands of a man who had spent his life in communion with the earth. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said softly, not wishing to startle him. He looked up, his eyes a surprisingly pale grey. "Afternoon, Mum." His voice was a low burr, thick with the local accent. "Enjoying the party?" "Very much. You must be Mr. Gable, the head gardener. I have heard such wonderful things about your work." A flicker of pride warmed his face. "Sir Alistair knows what he wants, and I make it happen. 30 years I've been here. I know every stone and every root in this place." "This section is particularly interesting," Miss Marple observed, peering at the labels. "Belladonna, aconite, ricinus. One must be very careful here." "That you must, Mum," Gable said, rising to his feet and wiping his hands on his trousers. "Sir Alistair, he's fascinated by the old ways. The power in these leaves and berries. Knows them all by name, Latin and common. Aconite there," he pointed with a thick finger. "They call that monkshood or wolfsbane. Beautiful flower, but the deadliest plant in the garden. And that one," he gestured to a castor oil plant, "Ricinus communis. The beans are what'll kill you. A tiny amount is all it takes." His tone was purely factual, the dispassionate statement of an expert, yet it sent a faint chill down Miss Marple's spine. She thought of the tension simmering on the sun-drenched lawn, the unhappy wife, the bitter son, the tyrannical host. Here, within this very garden, grew the means for a quiet and terrible resolution. As she made her way back to the party, she nearly bumped into the quiet cousin, Eleanor Vance. She was carrying a small tray with a glass of what appeared to be lemonade. She was, just as Joan had described, a mousy woman, dressed in a shade of beige that seemed designed to make her disappear into the background. She murmured an apology, her eyes cast down, and scurried past as if terrified of being drawn into a conversation. Miss Marple noticed, however, the quick, almost furtive glance the woman cast towards the Physic Garden, a look of intense, unreadable emotion that was gone in an instant. The party continued. The champagne flowed, small talk buzzed like the bees in the lavender, and the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the perfect lawn. Sir Alistair stood in the centre of it all, a king in his meticulously crafted kingdom, oblivious to the resentments that swirled around him like the midges in the evening air. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of tea, watched him. She saw the way his wife flinched when he spoke to her, the way his son avoided his gaze, the way the doctor, a portly man named Armitage, who had arrived late, engaged him in a conversation that seemed more intense than the occasion warranted. She felt a familiar sense of disquiet, a feeling she had learned to trust over many years. It was the feeling of things being not quite right, of smiles that did not reach the eyes, and of a peace that was merely a fragile veneer over something ugly and strained. It was a feeling she had often had in St. Mary Mead, just before some unfortunate event came to pass. The air at Elderflower House, for all its fragrance of roses and honeysuckle, was thick with unspoken words and poisoned thoughts. Chapter 2. A Death in the Morning. The Sunday morning that followed the garden party was the very picture of English pastoral bliss. The church bells of St. Michael's pealed across the valley, a gentle summoning sound that spoke of centuries of unwavering routine. At Raymond West's house, breakfast was a leisurely affair on the terrace, the sunlight warming the flagstones and the scent of Joan's climbing roses sweetening the air. Raymond was in fine form, holding forth on the subject of the modern detective novel, which he felt had lost its way in a quagmire of unnecessary grit and psychological navel-gazing. The puzzle, my dear Aunt Jane, is everything. The elegant, intricate puzzle. All this sordid business with flawed alcoholic inspectors, it's a bore. Give me a good, clean, impossible crime and a brilliant mind to unravel it. Miss Marple, spreading a thin layer of marmalade on her toast, smiled faintly. "Life is not always so neat, Raymond," she observed. "People are rarely as clean as the crimes they commit. I find the flaws are often the most illuminating part, like a dropped stitch in a pattern. It's the imperfection that tells you where to look." Their conversation was interrupted by the shrill, insistent ringing of the telephone from inside the house. Joan, with a sigh of apology, rose to answer it. A moment later she reappeared in the doorway, her face pale, her expression one of shocked disbelief. "That was Beatrice Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something terrible has happened. It's Sir Alistair. He's dead." Raymond put down his coffee cup with a clatter. "Dead? Good heavens, how? A stroke, I suppose? The man was practically purple with rage half the time. I'm not surprised his heart gave out." Joan shook her head, her eyes wide. "They don't know. He was in his study. Eleanor Vance found him this morning when he didn't come down for breakfast. Dr. Armitage is there now. Beatrice was barely coherent. She asked if I could come. She doesn't want to be alone." "Of course, my dear, of course," Raymond said, his novelist's instincts already whirring beneath a veneer of concern. "We'll go at once." Miss Marple quietly folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. The disquiet she had felt the previous evening had coalesced into a cold, hard certainty. The dropped stitch had appeared. Elderflower House, which had been a stage for social pleasantries less than 24 hours before, was now a place of hushed, fearful silence. The gravel of the drive seemed to crunch more loudly under the car's tires, an intrusion on a house already in mourning. The front door was opened not by a maid, but by a pale and shaken Julian Finch. His customary sneer was gone, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. He seemed younger, less sure of himself. "Joan, thank you for coming," he said, his voice hoarse. He nodded awkwardly at Raymond and Miss Marple. "Beatrice is in the morning room. She's in a state." They found Lady Finch huddled on a chintz sofa, a cashmere shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. Her beauty had dissolved into a mask of tear-streaked grief. Eleanor Vance, the mousy companion, was hovering nearby, holding a cup of tea that Beatrice had clearly not touched. Upon seeing Joan, Beatrice burst into a fresh storm of sobs, and Joan went to her at once, murmuring words of comfort. Miss Marple's gaze, however, rested on Eleanor. The woman was the very picture of quiet efficiency, her movements small and precise. Yet, Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled as she placed the teacup on a side table, and the manner in which her eyes, red-rimmed as if from lack of sleep, darted towards the door, towards the hallway, towards anywhere but the grieving woman she was meant to be comforting. It was a look not of sympathy, but of profound, gut-wrenching fear. Dr. Armitage emerged from the hallway that led to the study, his round face grim and beaded with perspiration. He was a man accustomed to seeing death, but there was a deep unease in his manner that went beyond the professional. "A terrible business," he said, his voice low. "A dreadful shock for you all." "What happened, Doctor?" Raymond asked, stepping into the role of the practical man of affairs. "Was it his heart?" Dr. Armitage hesitated, polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief, a gesture that gave him a moment to compose his words. At first glance, one might assume so. He was there at his desk, slumped in his chair, no signs of a struggle. It looked for all the world as if he had simply passed away in his sleep. "But," Raymond prompted, sensing the doctor's reservation. "But," the doctor continued, his voice dropping even lower, "there are certain inconsistencies. The position of the body, a glass on the desk beside him, and a particular smell I can't quite place. I have taken the liberty of telephoning the police. I felt it was the only proper course of action." A sharp intake of breath came from the sofa. "The police?" Beatrice whispered, her face ashen. "Why? Why the police?" "It is merely a precaution, my dear Lady Finch," Dr. Armitage said, though his tone lacked conviction. "When a death is sudden and unattended, it is standard procedure." At that moment, a car was heard on the gravel outside, and soon after, 2 men were shown into the room. The first was a tall, sturdily built man with a reassuringly calm demeanour, who introduced himself as Inspector Slack. His companion was a younger, more eager-looking sergeant. Slack had a reputation in the county for being thorough and methodical, if not particularly imaginative. His eyes took in the scene, the distraught widow, the resentful son, the terrified companion, the concerned neighbours, and filed it all away. "I'm very sorry for your trouble, my lady," he began, his voice a model of professional sympathy. "Dr. Armitage has explained the situation. I'll need to ask everyone to remain here for the time being. I must secure the room in question." He and the sergeant disappeared down the hall, leaving a thick, uncomfortable silence in their wake. Julian Finch walked to the window and stared out at his father's perfect gardens, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly in a wingback chair, an unobtrusive observer, felt a gentle presence beside her. It was Eleanor Vance. "Can I get you something, madam?" she asked, her voice a nervous flutter. "A glass of water, perhaps?" "That is very kind of you, my dear, but I am quite all right," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "You found him, I believe? It must have been a terrible shock." Eleanor flinched, her pale skin seeming to grow even paler. "It was horrible. He always took a glass of warm milk, with a splash of whiskey before bed. The tray was still outside his door this morning, untouched. That's why I knocked. When there was no answer, I tried the handle. The door was unlocked." She shuddered, wrapping her thin arms around herself. "He was a man of routine, then?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, yes. Sir Alister's life was a timetable, everything in its proper place at its proper time. He would work in his study on his papers until precisely 10 o'clock, then take his drink, and then retire, every single night." Inspector Slack returned, his face impassive. "The glass on the desk," he said, addressing the room at large. It contained the dregs of some sort of cordial. Did Sir Alistair often take a nightcap in his study? Beatrice looked up, her expression bewildered. "A cordial? No, never. Only his hot milk. He was very particular about that. He said cordials and squashes were common." Slack's gaze sharpened. "I see. And can anyone tell me what he was working on last night?" "The same thing he was always working on," Julian said, turning from the window, his voice laced with its old bitterness. "His magnum opus. A complete catalogue of his bloody plants. Cross-referencing every species, every variant. It was his life's work. More important than his wife, certainly more important than his son." The inspector made a note in his little book. He then looked around the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on each person. "I will need to take statements from everyone in the household. I trust you will all make yourselves available." His words hung in the air, transforming them from a family and their guests into something else, a collection of suspects. The sun still streamed through the tall windows, the birds still sang in the immaculate gardens, but the peace of Elderflower House had been irrevocably shattered. In its place was a cold and creeping dread. Miss Marple's knitting needles lay still in her lap. She was thinking of the physic garden, with its neat rows of labelled plants. She recalled the head gardener's words, "A tiny amount is all it takes." She thought of the glass of cordial, a break in an ironclad routine, and she looked at the faces in the room. Grief, fear, bitterness, shock. It was all very sad, she thought. But it was also, as her nephew Raymond might have put it, a most interesting puzzle. Chapter 3. The First Interviews. Inspector Slack was a man who believed in process. He commandeered the dining room at Elderflower House, a sombre space panelled in dark oak, and turned it into his temporary headquarters. The long, polished mahogany table, which had hosted countless formal dinners, now served as his desk. One by one, the members of the household were summoned to sit in the high-backed chair opposite him, a process that felt uncomfortably like a trial. Miss Marple, along with Raymond and Joan, had been politely asked to wait in the morning room. Raymond was pacing, his novelist's mind alight with speculation. "It's Julian, of course," he declared, running a hand through his hair. "The motive is as old as time itself, the disinherited son. He argued with the old man, stormed off for a walk, and crept back in to do the deed. It's classic." "It seems a little too obvious, don't you think, dear?" Joan remarked, her practical nature resisting such a tidy conclusion. "And what about the cordial? Why would he use that?" "A red herring," Raymond exclaimed, "to make it look like someone else, someone who might offer the old man a friendly drink." Miss Marple said nothing, her needles clicking softly. Her eyes were thoughtful. She was not thinking of red herrings, but of human nature. She was remembering the stark terror in Eleanor Vance's eyes. It was more than the fear of being involved in a sudden death. It was the fear of discovery. Their vigil was interrupted when a flustered-looking maid entered. "Inspector Slack's compliments, madam," she said to Miss Marple. "And he was wondering if you'd mind answering a few questions, as you were a guest at the party yesterday." "Of course," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting with a placid air. Raymond looked surprised, but she followed the maid without comment. Inspector Slack looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of duty and mild puzzlement, at having to interview this gentle-looking old lady. "Miss Marple, thank you for your time. Just a formality. I'm establishing a timeline of events from yesterday evening. You were at the garden party, I understand?" "Yes, Inspector. It was a most beautiful party. The gardens are quite magnificent." "Quite. And you left with your nephew at what time?" "It must have been around 7 o'clock. The sun was beginning to set. Did you notice anything unusual? Any arguments, any distress among the family?" Miss Marple considered this. She thought of Julian's bitterness, of Beatrice's strange smile. "There are always undercurrents in families, Inspector," she said mildly, "particularly when there is a strong personality at the head of it. Sir Alistair was a very determined man. He had a temper, you mean? I believe he liked things to be just so," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It is not quite the same thing." She then added, as if it were an afterthought, "The elderflower cordial they were serving was quite delicious. So refreshing. Homemade, I should imagine." Slack blinked, momentarily thrown by the non sequitur. "Cordial? Ah, yes, thank you, Miss Marple. That will be all for now." As she left the dining room, she passed Lady Finch, who was being escorted in by the sergeant. Beatrice's face was still pale, but the initial storm of grief had subsided, leaving behind a kind of exhausted fragility. Her interview, as Slack would later recount to his sergeant, was filled with tears and vagaries. She and Alistair had dined at 8. It had been a quiet, tense meal. Afterwards, around 8:30, he had gone directly to his study, as was his custom. She had developed a headache and had gone up to her room at 9:30, taking 2 aspirin with a glass of water. She had not seen her husband again. No, she had no idea where the cordial had come from. Alistair detested such things. She had not heard any unusual noises during the night. Julian Finch was next. He strode into the room with a defiant air, his hands in his pockets. His grief, if he felt any, was buried deep beneath layers of resentment. "Let's get this over with, Inspector," he said, slumping into the chair. "You think I did it, don't you?" "I am merely gathering facts, Mr. Finch," Slack said calmly. "You argued with your father yesterday, I believe." "We always argued," Julian retorted. "It was our primary mode of communication. Yesterday's topic was my debts. He felt I was a disgrace to the family name. I felt he was a miserly old tyrant. The usual exchange of pleasantries. And what happened after dinner last night? I couldn't stand another moment in this mausoleum. I went for a walk, a long one." "Where did you go?" "Just out, across the fields, towards the old quarry. I needed to breathe." "What time did you return to the house?" "I don't know. Late. After 11, certainly. I came in through the side door and went straight to my room." "Did anyone see you come in?" A flicker of a sneer returned to Julian's lips. "This isn't a French farce, Inspector. The servants were in bed. I didn't bump into the maid on the staircase, if that's what you're asking." He was, Slack thought, doing a remarkable job of making himself look guilty. The final interview of the main family was with Eleanor Vance. She entered the room like a frightened mouse, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were white. She perched on the very edge of the chair, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Her account of the evening was simple. After dinner, she had helped Lady Finch clear a few things, then retired to her own room at 9 o'clock to read. "You didn't leave your room again, Miss Vance?" Slack asked, his gaze steady. "No, I did not," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. "You didn't hear Mr. Julian Finch return to the house?" "No, Inspector. My room is at the back of the house. I wouldn't have heard." "And you have no idea who might have given Sir Alistair a glass of cordial?" At this, a strange thing happened. A deep blush spread from her neck up to her face, a wave of hot, miserable colour. "No," she stammered, her voice barely audible. I cannot imagine." Slack watched her, his policeman's intuition telling him that this terrified woman was lying. She knew something, or she had done something, that she was desperate to conceal. But for now, he could push no further. He dismissed her and sat back, reviewing his notes. A tyrannical victim, a resentful son with a weak alibi, a distraught but vague widow, a terrified companion who was clearly hiding something. It was a classic setup. His musings were interrupted by the arrival of the police surgeon, a brisk, efficient man named Dr. Morris. He entered without knocking. "I've finished the preliminary examination, Inspector," he said, pulling off his gloves. "You can forget the heart attack theory." "I already have," Slack said grimly. "What have you got for me?" "Your victim was poisoned. A powerful, fast-acting alkaloid neurotoxin. Causes paralysis of the respiratory system, cardiac arrest. Nasty stuff. Very nasty. Can you identify it?" Dr. Morris nodded. "I'd stake my reputation on it. From the traces in the glass and the symptoms I'd infer, it's aconitine." Slack looked up sharply. "Aconitine? That's right. The active poison in the aconitum plant. You probably know it by its common name." A memory stirred in Slack's mind. Something he'd seen on a label the day before. Something the head gardener had said. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Monkshood," he said, "or wolfsbane." "The very same," the doctor confirmed, "and a remarkably convenient source of it seems to be growing no more than 100 yards from the house. Your killer, Inspector, didn't have to go far to find a murder weapon." The investigation had now officially become a hunt for a poisoner, and everyone at Elderflower House was a suspect. Chapter 4. The Poison Garden. The police surgeon's words hung in the sombre dining room like a toxic vapour. Aconitine, monkshood, a poison grown just a stone's throw from the house. Inspector Slack felt a grim satisfaction. The case, which had been a nebulous cloud of suspicion, now had a solid, tangible core. He knew the what, the where, and the how. All that remained was the who. "Sergeant, come with me," he ordered, his voice crisp. "We're going to have a word with the gardener." They found Mr. Gable in his potting shed. A sanctuary of earthy smells, neatly coiled twine, and the sharp scent of geraniums. He was cleaning his tools with an oily rag, his movements methodical and calming. He looked up as the policeman entered, his weathered face betraying no surprise. In a place like Little Hembury, news of a police presence travelled faster than a swallow on the wing. "Mr. Gable," Slack began, dispensing with pleasantries. "The garden. I need to know about the aconitum plants, the monkshood." Gable placed his secateurs down carefully. "Aye, Inspector. Nasty stuff. Sir Alistair was always very clear. Treat it with respect, Gable, he'd say. Nature's power is not to be trifled with." "Is the garden kept locked?" "Oh, always," the gardener affirmed, nodding. "Sir Alistair insisted. The gate has a sturdy lock. Especially important with the village children sometimes getting onto the estate." "And where is the key?" Slack asked, his eyes scanning the shed, taking in the rows of keys hanging from a board. Gable pointed with a soil-stained finger. "On that hook there. The big iron one. Always is. The staff know where to find it if they need herbs for the kitchen, rosemary, thyme, that sort of thing. They're in a separate bed, well away from the dangerous ones." Slack's heart sank a little. A key kept in a known location was almost as bad as no lock at all. So, anyone in the household could have accessed it. Anyone who knew where the key was, Gable conceded. And who knew about the monk's hood? Who knew it was poisonous? The gardener paused, leaning back against his workbench. Well, Sir Alistair, of course. He was the expert. Knew more than I did, and I've been at it 50 years. He'd read all the old herbals, knew what they used it for in the old days. And the family? Gable pursed his lips. Mr. Julian, he never had no interest. Dead plants, he called them. All he cared about was when the next cheque was coming from his father. The scorn in the old man's voice was unmistakable. Lady Finch. She found it all a bit morbid. A beautiful flower with a dark secret, she said once. Didn't like to go in there. He paused, and his gaze seemed to turn inward, searching his memory. The other one, though, Miss Vance, she was different. Different how? Slack prompted, his attention sharpening. Quiet she is, but she listens. She'd sometimes come and watch me work, asked questions, not about the roses or the dahlias, but about the strange ones, the ones with stories. She asked about the monk's hood once, what it was called, its history, seemed fascinated by it, in a shy sort of way. The inspector filed this information away. It fit perfectly with the image of the terrified, blushing woman in the dining room. Meanwhile, back in the morning room, the atmosphere was thick with a strained silence. Beatrice had retired to her room, overcome with a fresh wave of grief, or perhaps shock at the confirmation of murder. Julian prowled the room like a caged animal, his earlier defiance curdling into a sullen anxiety. Miss Marple, observing him over the top of her knitting, remarked to Joan, "It is a terrible thing to lose a father, even one with whom a relationship is difficult." "He seems more angry than sad," Joan whispered back. "Grief takes many forms, my dear," Miss Marple said, "and for some, anger is the only acceptable one. It is a shield. It is often the ones who protest the loudest who feel the most." She thought of young George Pritchard in St. Mary Mead, who had made such a dreadful scene after his father's death, only for it to be discovered that he was consumed with guilt over a final, bitter argument. Her gaze drifted to the window, which looked out onto a side terrace. She saw Eleanor Vance slip out of a side door, clutching a small watering can. She moved with a furtive haste, heading not towards the main gardens, but towards a small, secluded conservatory at the far end of the house. It was a forgotten-looking place, the glass panes in need of a clean. "I wonder what grows in there," Miss Marple mused aloud, her curiosity piqued by the woman's secretive manner. Inspector Slack, having left his sergeant to oversee a thorough search of the potting shed and the grounds around the physic garden, returned to the house. He was frustrated. The key was a dead end. The entire household had access. His case against Julian was purely circumstantial, based on motive and a weak alibi. But his intuition, the policeman's sixth sense that had served him well for 20 years, screamed that Eleanor Vance was the key. Her fear was disproportionate. It was the fear of guilt. He made a decision. He would break her. He found her in the small conservatory Miss Marple had noticed. The air inside was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something sweet and floral. The place was filled with pots of elderflowers, cultivated with a surprising degree of care. Eleanor was tending to them, her movements precise and loving. She started violently as the inspector's shadow fell over her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to ask you some more questions." She shrank back, her hand flying to her throat. I've told you everything I know." "Have you?" Slack took a step closer. "Let's talk about the cordial, shall we?" The elderflower cordial that Sir Alistair drank last night. Her face, already pale, turned a deathly white. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. "I believe you made that cordial, Miss Vance," Slack continued, his voice hardening. "I believe you took it to him, and I believe you know exactly what was in it." Eleanor Vance looked from the inspector's implacable face to the beloved plants that surrounded her. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the tiled floor in a dead faint. Chapter 5. A Partial Confession. Eleanor Vance's faint was not a theatrical one. It was a complete and sudden collapse, a surrender of a system overloaded with terror. Inspector Slack, momentarily taken aback, found himself kneeling on the damp floor, gruffly calling for his sergeant. Water was brought, wrists were chafed, and after a few moments that felt like an eternity, Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open. She stared up at the glass roof of the conservatory, her expression one of utter desolate confusion. They helped her to a rickety iron chair, and the sergeant stood by with a glass of water, which she sipped with a trembling hand. The fight, it seemed, had gone out of her. The fear was still there, but it was now a dull, resigned terror, not the sharp, panicked kind of before. "Now, Miss Vance," Slack began again, his voice considerably softer. A fainting woman was not a hardened criminal, and his instinct told him that bullying would get him nowhere now. "Let's start again." The cordial, she didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on her beloved elderflower plants, as if they were the only friendly things in her world. "I did make it," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "I took it to him." The inspector exchanged a look with his sergeant. "This was it. When did you take it to him?" "At about 9:45. I knew he would be finished with his work soon. I knocked on the study door." "And he let you in?" A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Oh, yes. He was different when we were alone. Not so loud, not so angry." She looked up at Slack, a plea for understanding in her watery eyes. "People didn't see that side of him. He could be quiet. He remembered my mother, you see. She was his cousin. He felt a duty to me, and he liked my cordial. It was a little secret between us. He said it reminded him of his childhood." This was an unexpected complication. Slack had built a picture of a universally despised tyrant. A secret sentimental side did not fit. "So you took him the drink. What happened then?" "He was tired," she said, her voice drifting as if she were replaying the scene in her mind. "He thanked me. I put the tray on his desk, next to his lamp. He said he would drink it as he tidied his papers before bed. I said good night, and I left." "You left him alive and well?" "Yes!" The whisper rose in pitch, gaining a desperate strength. "Of course, yes, I could never harm him. He was my benefactor. He gave me a home." "But you were fascinated by the poisons in the garden, Miss Vance," Slack pressed, hardening his tone again. "Mr. Gable told me. You asked about the monk's hood." Her face crumpled. the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "I was curious, that's all. Sir Alister's books. They were full of such things, old stories, folklore. It was just interesting. A beautiful flower that could kill. It seemed like something from a fairy tale. I never touched it. I swear on my mother's grave, I never went near that part of the garden." Her denial was passionate, convincing. And yet, she had the knowledge, she had the opportunity, and she had lied. Slack was in a quandary, had a confession that placed her at the scene of the crime, providing the murder weapon just minutes before the estimated time of death. It was enough to arrest her on suspicion. It was, in fact, his duty to do so. He was about to speak when his sergeant cleared his throat. "Sir, while Miss Vance was indisposed, we completed the search of her room." Slack turned. "And?" The sergeant held up a small cork-stoppered glass bottle, the kind one might buy from a chemist. It was half full of a dark liquid. "Found this at the back of her wardrobe, sir, tucked inside a hat box." Slack took the bottle, uncorked it, and sniffed cautiously. It was odourless. He looked at Eleanor, whose eyes were fixed on the bottle in absolute horror. "What is this, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice cold as steel. It's for my plants," she stammered. "A tonic to keep away the green fly." "Really? We'll have this analysed, of course, and we will be searching your conservatory very, very carefully." He looked at her, his mind made up. Her story was touching, but the evidence was piling up. The lie, the knowledge, the opportunity, and now a suspicious hidden bottle. "Eleanor Vance," he said formally, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Sir Alister Finch. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." Eleanor let out a thin, high wail of despair, as the sergeant took her gently by the arm. The sound seemed to echo in the humid air of the little conservatory. A final, hopeless protest. News of the arrest spread through the house like fire through dry grass. Julian received it with a stunned silence, his defiant anger draining away to be replaced by a look of disbelief. Beatrice, when told, simply wept, murmuring, "Poor Eleanor! Oh, poor foolish Eleanor!" Miss Marple received the news from a visibly shaken Joan. She listened intently, her needles for once quite still. "They found a bottle of something in her room," Joan finished, wringing her hands. "An insecticide, she says, but the police think it's the poison." "Dear me," Miss Marple said softly. "It does sound very damning. The poor woman." "You think she's innocent?" Raymond asked, surprised. "Aunt Jane, it all fits. She was the downtrodden companion, secretly resentful. She learns about the poisons, brews up a batch, and slips it into the old man's nightly drink under the guise of kindness. It's a perfect quiet woman's crime." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. "It is a very neat picture, Raymond," she agreed, "and that is what troubles me. Murder is rarely so neat. It is a messy, passionate business. Fainting and weeping. That is not the behaviour of a cool, calculating poisoner. That is the behaviour of a terrified rabbit." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out towards the little conservatory where the drama had unfolded. "There is something wrong with the picture," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "A detail is out of place." She was thinking of Eleanor's hands as she tended her plants. They were the hands of a nurturer, gentle and careful, and she was thinking of the cordial, a secret, shared kindness. It seemed an unlikely vessel for a murderous hatred. "Inspector Slack is a very capable man," she said, turning back to the room. "But he sees what is in front of him. He sees a frightened woman who lied. He does not perhaps see the reason for the lie. She picked up her knitting again, and the needles began to click, faster this time, like the workings of a clock, or of a mind setting itself to a difficult and intricate problem. Chapter 6. The Wrong Tray. With Eleanor Vance's arrest, a semblance of order returned to Elderflower House, but it was the sterile, unnatural order of a room where a death has occurred. Inspector Slack and his men had departed, leaving a profound silence in their wake. The official narrative had been written. A downtrodden, mentally unstable companion, harbouring a secret resentment, had used her knowledge of the garden's deadly secrets to murder her benefactor. It was a tidy, tragic story that satisfied the authorities and would, in time, satisfy the newspapers. It did not, however, satisfy Miss Marple. "It's the lie," she said the following morning, as she sat with Joan on the sunlit terrace. Raymond had driven into the village for the papers, eager to see the first reports. "Inspector Slack believes he has found the reason for her lie, to conceal her guilt, but I believe he may have mistaken the subject of the lie entirely." "What do you mean, Aunt Jane?" Joan asked, pouring them both more tea. "She lied about taking the cordial to Sir Alistair. That seems quite straightforward." "She was terrified, my dear," Miss Marple explained, her gaze distant, "like Mrs. Bartlett's girl, Elsie, in St. Mary Mead, who swore she hadn't broken the china dog. And she hadn't, but she had been in the room to sneak a biscuit, which was also forbidden. She was so frightened of being found out for the small crime that she behaved exactly like someone guilty of the larger one. People, you see, are not always logical when they are afraid. I wonder what Eleanor Vance's sneaked biscuit was." An opportunity to ponder this further presented itself later that day. Joan needed to return to Elderflower House to deliver a book that Beatrice had requested, something to distract her from the grim reality of her new widowhood. Miss Marple, expressing a desire to see the famous rose gardens one more time, accompanied her. While Joan went inside to see the grieving Beatrice, Miss Marple found her way to the gardens. As she had hoped, she found Mr. Gable meticulously deadheading roses, his movements as steady and reliable as the seasons. "Good morning, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice a gentle intrusion into his peaceful work. "The roses are even more beautiful than I remembered." The gardener's face softened. "They're at their best this week, Mum. A bit of sun after the rain. That's what they like." He snipped off a perfect creamy white bloom and offered it to her. "For you, Mum, a Margaret Merrill." "How very kind," Miss Marple said, inhaling its sweet citrusy fragrance. "It must be a comfort to be surrounded by such beauty, especially when there's such ugliness in the house." Gable's expression clouded over. "A terrible business. I've been here 30 years and never seen the like. And poor Miss Eleanor, I can't make sense of it. She was always so gentle. Wouldn't harm a fly, I'd have said." "She was very fond of Sir Alistair, I believe," Miss Marple prompted gently. "In her way, yes," Gable conceded. "He wasn't an easy man, but he was good to her. Gave her a home when she had none. And she'd do little things for him, like that cordial she made. He was partial to that. It is a small domestic kindness, is it not?" Miss Marple mused. "The sort of thing that speaks of affection. One imagines she had a special way of serving it to him." Gable nodded, warming to the subject, glad to be on the firmer ground of household routine. "Oh, she did. Very particular she was. Cook was just saying so yesterday. Miss Eleanor always used the little silver tray from the morning room, the one with the scalloped edges. Said it was the proper tray for a gentleman's study." Miss Marple's hands holding the rose became very still. A picture floated in her mind. The grim-faced sergeant carrying evidence out of the study, and on the evidence tray, a simple wooden tray with a glass. A silver tray, she repeated, her voice perfectly level. That is interesting. I suppose the police have taken it away for their investigation. Gable looked puzzled. The silver one? No, Mum, it's still in the morning room. I saw it myself this morning. The police, they took the tray that was in the study. One of the big plain ones from the kitchen pantry. The one cook uses for the post. He turned back to his roses, oblivious to the bombshell he had just delivered. But for Miss Marple, the world had tilted on its axis. The neat picture Raymond had painted, the tidy story Inspector Slack had constructed, had just been ripped down the middle. Eleanor Vance, a woman of meticulous routine, a woman who used a special silver tray as a mark of respect and affection for her benefactor, had apparently, on the night she decided to poison him, inexplicably used a common kitchen tray instead. It made no sense. It was the wrong stitch in the pattern, a glaring, impossible inconsistency. Unless, of course, Eleanor was not the one who had left the tray in the study. Unless someone else had come to the study after Eleanor had left. Someone who had brought their own tray. Or perhaps found the glass of cordial, added the poison, and then in their haste or ignorance placed it on the nearest available tray. Miss Marple looked at the perfect white rose in her hand. Its beauty was flawless, but she knew, as Mr. Gable knew, that its roots were deep in the dark, messy, complicated earth. The case against Eleanor Vance, she now felt certain, was a beautiful, simple, and utterly false flower. The truth was still buried, and she would have to dig for it. Chapter 7. The Cook's Testimony. The mind, Miss Marple often thought, was like a cluttered sewing box. You had to rummage through a great many scraps and oddments to find the particular thread you needed. Her conversation with Mr. Gable had provided her with a crucial, gleaming thread. The wrong tray. Now she needed to see if it would hold a stitch. Her opportunity came when Joan, having finished her visit with Beatrice, found her on a bench overlooking the herbaceous border. "Beatrice is completely exhausted," Joan said, her voice full of sympathy. "She's asked if we could possibly stay for a light lunch. She can't bear the thought of being alone with just Julian." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her mind already working. A light lunch meant the kitchen would be active. "I wonder," she added with a thoughtful air, "if I might have a quiet word with the cook. The scones at the party were simply divine. I should very much like her recipe." It was the perfect excuse. Mrs. Higgins, the cook at Elderflower House, was a stout, red-faced woman who ruled her kitchen with a firm but fair hand. She was flustered but flattered by the request from the gentle old lady. "My scones, madam," she said, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "It's no secret, really, just good butter and a light hand." "A light hand is a gift," Miss Marple said, smiling, "as is a well-run house. Everything here seems to work like clockwork. It must be a comfort in such difficult time." Mrs. Higgins's cheerful expression soured. "It's a terrible, wicked thing, that's what it is. And to blame it on poor Miss Eleanor, it's not right. She's a bit of a mouse, I'll grant you, but a poisoner? Never." "You were fond of her, then?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of simple, friendly interest. "She was no trouble," the cook said firmly. "Kept to herself. The only time you'd see her in here was when she was making that cordial for the master. Very particular she was about it too. Had her own little corner for the steeping and the straining. And always, she'd come to the morning room to fetch that little silver tray to serve it on. said it was the proper way. The thread was holding. Such a creature of habit, Miss Marple murmured. It is the little routines that make up a life, are they not? That they are, Mrs. Higgins agreed. Unlike some I could mention. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Oh? The cook lowered her voice, the temptation to gossip overcoming her professional discretion. Mr. Julian, for one. Supposed to have gone for a long walk that night, he was. But I know for a fact he was back here long before 11. I'd come down for a glass of milk for my indigestion, see? It must have been 9:30, maybe 9:45. I heard the side door open and close, as quiet as you please, and then I heard him on the back stairs, creeping up to his room like a thief. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. 9:45. The exact time Eleanor Vance was delivering the cordial to the study. Julian had not been wandering the fields for hours as he claimed. He had been in the house. "And what of Lady Finch?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual. "She retired early with a headache, I believe." Mrs. Higgins sniffed, a sound rich with meaning. "Headache," she said. "But she was on the telephone in the hall just after. I heard her from the kitchen, talking low and urgent-like. To Dr. Armitage it was." "The doctor?" Miss Marple was surprised. "At that hour?" "Aye. You must be patient, Beatrice," I heard him say. "These things cannot be rushed." Sounded very familiar with her, if you ask me. And her calling him after the master had gone to his study. Well, it's not my place to say, but it seemed queer. A secret conversation. A doctor, a friend of the family, telling the young wife of a much older man that she must be patient. A new and potentially scandalous thread had just appeared in Miss Marple's sewing box. "You have been most kind, Mrs. Higgins," Miss Marple said, rising, "and I am most grateful for the scone recipe." She left the kitchen and found her way to the morning room. There it was, on a sideboard, gleaming softly in the light from the window. A small, elegant silver tray with scalloped edges. It was an object of refined, affectionate service. It told a story of habit and care, and it was a world away from the plain, functional wooden tray that had been found in the study. Miss Marple now had two crucial pieces of information that Inspector Slack did not. First, Julian Finch had lied about his alibi. He was in the house at the critical time. Why would he lie unless he had something to hide? Was it his own sneaked biscuit? Perhaps he had come back to search his father's study for papers or money and didn't want to admit it. Second, Beatrice Finch, the grieving widow, had a secret late-night conversation with Dr. Armitage. A conversation that hinted at a shared, clandestine purpose. What was it that couldn't be rushed? What were they being patient for? The case was no longer about a downtrodden companion. It was about a web of secrets and lies, and at its centre were a son who needed money and a young wife who counselled patience by a doctor. The air in Elderflower House, Miss Marple thought, was more poisoned than anyone had yet realized. Chapter 8. The Pressure of a Story. The light lunch was a profoundly uncomfortable affair. It was served in the small, sun-filled breakfast room, a space that should have been cheerful, but was instead freighted with unspoken tensions. Beatrice, pale and picking at a plate of cold salmon, sat at one end of the table. Julian, sullen and silent, sat at the other. Joan and Raymond, caught in the middle, made valiant but faltering attempts at neutral conversation, discussing the weather and a recent exhibition in London with a forced brightness that fooled no one. Miss Marple, however, seemed entirely at ease. She ate her salmon with a quiet appreciation, and spoke very little, her bright bird-like eyes moving thoughtfully from one face to another. She was waiting for the right moment, the lull in the conversation when a carefully placed stone could send ripples across the still, dark water. The moment came when Raymond, having exhausted the topic of modern art, fell silent. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery and the distant hum of a lawnmower. "It reminds me of a very sad business we had in St. Mary Mead some years ago," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle and conversational, as if she were merely filling the silence. "It concerned young Freddie Lawes, a very high-spirited boy, always getting into scrapes." Julian looked up, a flicker of irritation in his eyes at what he clearly considered to be the ramblings of a dotty old woman. "He was suspected of something quite dreadful," Miss Marple continued, her gaze fixed on her plate. "The church collection box was stolen, you see, and Freddie, when asked where he was at the time, told a most elaborate lie. He said he had been miles away, visiting an aunt. It was a very foolish lie, because of course the aunt was telephoned, and it was all discovered. It made him look terribly guilty." She paused to take a small sip of water. "And all because of a little bit of vanity. He had been trying to teach himself to ride the baker's old bicycle, you see, and had taken a tumble in the ditch. He was covered in mud, and his pride was hurt. He didn't want to admit to such a silly thing, so he invented a much grander, and ultimately much more dangerous story. He lied to cover up a small foolishness, and in doing so, made everyone believe he was capable of a great wickedness." Miss Marple looked up, her clear blue eyes meeting Julian's for a fraction of a second. "It is so often the way, is it not? A small secret action, harmless in itself, can look so very guilty from the outside." Julian's fork clattered onto his plate. The colour had drained from his face. He stared at Miss Marple, his mouth a thin, hard line. The story of Freddie Lawes and his bicycle had hit its mark with unnerving accuracy. Before he could speak, Beatrice stirred, dabbing at her lips with a napkin. "People do tell lies," she said, her voice brittle, "to protect themselves or to protect others." "Oh, indeed, my dear," Miss Marple agreed, her attention shifting smoothly to the lady of the house. "But secrets are such a burden, and patience is a virtue that is so often in short supply. I remember poor Mrs. Gable, the gardener's first wife. Ailing for years she was, and Dr. Haydock was so very attentive. But there was talk, you know. People said he was perhaps a little too attentive, that they were both waiting, being patient. It was all quite innocent, of course. He was simply a very dedicated doctor, but the appearance of it caused a great deal of unhappiness. A secret understanding, however innocent, can look very much like a conspiracy to a suspicious mind." Beatrice's hand trembled as she placed her napkin on the table. The reference to a doctor, to patients, to a secret understanding was too pointed to be a coincidence. Her eyes darted towards the telephone in the hall, the scene of her clandestine conversation. The pressure in the room was now unbearable. Julian and Beatrice were pinned by these gentle, deadly little stories from a sleepy country village. It was Julian who broke first. He pushed his chair back with a harsh, scraping sound and stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "All right!" he burst out, his voice raw with a mixture of anger and desperation. "All right, I lied. I wasn't out walking for hours. Is that what you want to hear?" Raymond and Joan stared at him, shocked. Beatrice closed her eyes, as if in pain. "I came back," Julian continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was around 9:30. I let myself in the side door. I came back because I needed to get into the study. I needed to find my IOUs. He kept them in his desk drawer, a whole stack of them, like a noose around my neck. I was going to take them, destroy them. I thought if he was angry enough to cut me off, I might as well be free of him entirely. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed, but I couldn't get in. The door was locked from the inside. I heard him moving about in there. I waited on the back stairs for a few minutes, then I gave up and went to my room. I didn't kill him, but I was there to steal from him. So I lied, just like your bloody Freddie Laws. He glared at Miss Marple, a look of furious, resentful defeat in his eyes. He had confessed, not to murder, but to a shabby, pathetic crime that had given him the perfect, damning reason to lie to the police. The emotional dam had broken, and a torrent of partial truth had poured out, changing the entire landscape of the case. Chapter 9. The Doctor's Secret. Julian's explosive confession left a ringing silence in its wake. He remained standing, breathing heavily, a defiant but miserable figure caught in the spotlight of his own admission. Joan and Raymond were speechless, their neat theories about the crime dissolving before their eyes. Beatrice, however, did not look at her stepson. Her gaze was fixed on Miss Marple, and her expression was one of dawning, horrified understanding. She saw now that the gentle, rambling stories were not random. They were scalpels, used with devastating precision to cut away the scar tissue of lies and expose the wounds beneath. Into this charged atmosphere, the maid announced a visitor. "Dr. Armitage is here to see you, my lady." The doctor entered, a portly figure exuding an air of professional concern. "Beatrice, my dear, I came as soon as I could. I heard the news of the arrest. I wanted to see how you were bearing up." His eyes took in the scene, Julian's rigid posture, the shocked faces of the Wests, Beatrice's pale, strained face, and his expression of sympathy faltered, replaced by one of sharp anxiety. "It seems I have arrived at a difficult moment," he said, his gaze settling on Beatrice. "The truth is always difficult, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and clear in the tense room. "But secrets are a far heavier burden to carry, especially when one carries them for the sake of another." Dr. Armitage looked at Miss Marple, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, madam." "I was just telling a story about a doctor in my village," Miss Marple went on, her tone pleasantly conversational. "A very kind man who took on a great responsibility for a patient. The patient's family, you see, was not to be told the true gravity of the illness. The patient insisted upon it. So the doctor and the patient's wife, they had a secret. They had to be patient. It was a terrible strain for them both. The wife, in particular, was torn between her duty to her husband's wishes and her desire for the truth to be known. Every word was a gentle, deliberate turn of a key in a lock. Beatrice let out a small, choked sob. "Beatrice," Dr. Armitage said, moving to her side, his professional manner a shield. "You are overwrought." "No," Beatrice whispered, looking up at him, her eyes full of a desperate appeal. "No, I cannot. I cannot keep silent any longer. It is not fair. It is not fair to Eleanor." She turned her tear-streaked face to the room at large. "Sir Alistair was dying," she said, the words coming out in a rush of pent-up misery. "He had a severe heart condition, angina pectoris. Dr. Armitage diagnosed it 6 months ago. It was getting worse. Any great shock, any great exertion could have been fatal. But he forbade me to tell anyone, especially Julian." Julian stared at her, his anger forgotten, replaced by a look of profound shock. Dying? He never said a word. He was a proud man, Beatrice continued, her voice trembling. He refused to be seen as an invalid. He made me promise. He was putting his affairs in order, changing his will. That was the secret. That was why I telephoned Dr. Armitage on Saturday night. I was begging him to persuade Alistair to rest, to not get into another one of his terrible arguments with Julian. The doctor told me I must be patient, that Alistair would see reason in his own time. We were not having an affair, she added, a flash of spirit returning. We were conspiring to keep a stubborn old man alive. Dr. Armitage nodded grimly, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had carried a difficult professional secret. It is true, all of it. Alistair was living on borrowed time. I had given him a new prescription, a digitalis preparation to strengthen his heart. He was to take it only when he felt an attack coming on. He kept the bottle in his desk drawer. A new terrible silence descended on the room. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, reforming into a new and much clearer picture. Sir Alistair was not just a tyrant, he was a dying tyrant, secretly rewriting his will. Julian was not just a resentful son, he was a disinherited son, trying to steal back the evidence of his debts before the final axe fell. Beatrice was not just a young wife, she was the custodian of a medical secret, desperately trying to manage an impossible situation. The will, Raymond West said, his voice hushed with dawning comprehension. He was changing his will. Yes, Beatrice confirmed. He was making a new provision for Eleanor, a generous one. He told me he felt a great duty to her. He was also reducing Julian's inheritance significantly until his debts were paid. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. The motive was no longer just about resentment. It was about money, inheritance, and a ticking clock. And two people had known about the will. Beatrice, and presumably Sir Alistair's solicitor. But who else might have found out? The trap Miss Marple had set at the lunch table had yielded far more than she could have hoped. It had broken the lies of the son and the silence of the wife, revealing the true, desperate circumstances simmering beneath the surface of life at Elderflower House. The case against Eleanor Vance, the gentle companion, now seemed not just improbable, but utterly impossible. She had no motive to kill the man who was about to secure her future. But someone else did. Someone who knew about the new will. Someone who knew that Sir Alistair's time was running out, and decided to stop the clock for good. Chapter 10. The Gathering of Threads. The revelations of the afternoon had left the inhabitants of Elderflower House in a state of agitated paralysis. The carefully constructed facades had been torn down, leaving behind a raw and uncomfortable reality. It was into this fragile environment that Miss Marple chose to act. "Raymond, my dear," she said, approaching her nephew with a look of quiet determination. "I wonder if you would be so good as to telephone Inspector Slack. I believe it is a matter of some urgency that he returns here. A great injustice is about to be done, and I think with the information we now have, we might be able to prevent it." Raymond, who had been watching his aunt with a newfound and profound respect, did not question her. He went at once to the telephone. An hour later, a most unwilling collection of people was assembled in the main drawing room. Inspector Slack had arrived, his face a mask of professional skepticism, clearly irritated at having his closed case disturbed by the theories of an elderly amateur. Beatrice sat on the edge of a sofa, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Julian stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, a look of wary defiance on his face. Dr. Armitage, having been persuaded to stay, looked deeply uncomfortable, as if he had wandered into the final act of a play he did not understand. Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap. She seemed calm and unassuming, yet she was the undeniable centre of gravity in the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle but carrying a surprising authority. "And thank you, Inspector, for your patience. I know you believe this matter to be resolved, but there are one or two small points, anomalies you might say, that have been troubling me." Slack shifted his weight. "The case against Eleanor Vance is watertight, madam. She had the means, the opportunity, and her confession to delivering the drink." "Ah, yes, the drink," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "That is one of the points. You see, Inspector, you have a confession, but it is to the wrong crime." Miss Vance confessed to a kindness. She did not confess to a murder. Her lie, her terrible fear, was not that of a killer. It was the fear of a woman who had a secret, sentimental arrangement with her benefactor and was terrified that her innocent action would be misconstrued. As indeed it was. She turned her gaze to Julian. "Much like your lie, Mr. Finch. You lied to conceal a shabby, desperate act of theft, and in doing so, made yourself look like a murderer." She then looked at Beatrice and Doctor. "Armitage, and you, my dear, and you, Doctor, kept a painful secret out of loyalty to a dying man's pride. All these secrets, you see, created a fog, and in that fog, the real murderer was able to move unseen." "The real murderer?" Slack said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "And who might that be?" "We shall come to that," Miss Marple said calmly. "First, we must look at what is wrong with the pictures you have so carefully constructed. The first thing that is wrong is the motive. Eleanor Vance was to be a major beneficiary of Sir Alistair's new will. She, of all people, had the most to lose by his death before that will was signed and finalized. To kill him then would have been an act of madness." "She might not have known about the will," Slack countered. "Oh, I think she did," Miss Marple said. "A man like Sir Alistair, a man of duty, would have told her. He would have wanted to assure her that her future was secure. Her devotion was not that of a resentful servant, but of a grateful dependent who knew her loyalty was to be rewarded." She paused, letting the logic sink in. "But the most telling detail, the little thing that unravels the whole case, is a very simple domestic object. It is the tray." She recounted her conversation with the gardener and the cook, explaining the significance of the little silver tray with the scalloped edges. Eleanor Vance, a woman of meticulous habit, a woman who used that tray as a symbol of her affection, would never, on any night, have used a common kitchen tray. It is not in her character. But someone else, someone in a hurry, someone who did not know of the little ritual, might have done so. Someone who came to the study after Eleanor had left her glass of cordial. The room was utterly still. Miss Marple's quiet words were dismantling the official case, piece by logical piece. "Let us reconstruct the evening," she continued. "At 9:45, Eleanor delivers the cordial on her silver tray. Sir Alistair is alive. She leaves, at roughly the same time, Julian is on the back stairs, having found the study door locked. He gives up and goes to his room. A few minutes later, someone else goes to the study. This person does not find the door locked. This person goes inside, finds the glass of cordial that Eleanor has left, and adds the poison. This person, perhaps in a moment of panic, removes the silver tray, a clear sign of Eleanor's presence, and replaces it with a common wooden one from the pantry, to make the scene look less personal, more anonymous. Her eyes moved around the room, resting for a moment on each person. The question, therefore, is not who had the means and opportunity to poison the cordial. The question is, who had a motive powerful enough to commit murder that night? Who knew about the new will and stood to lose by it? And who had the medical knowledge to understand that a man with a severe heart condition might keep a bottle of digitalis, a heart stimulant, in his desk drawer? She looked directly at Dr. Armitage. A bottle that, if it were to be stolen, might be missed. A bottle that, if it were to be emptied and refilled with a colourless poison, might not. Dr. Armitage went rigid, his face turning a pasty, unhealthy grey. "This is outrageous," he blustered. "You are accusing me." "I am merely asking questions, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle, but with an undertone of pure steel. "Such as, what was the real reason for your late-night telephone call with Lady Finch? Was it truly to counsel patience? Or was it perhaps to confirm that the house was quiet, that Sir Alistair was in his study, and that the opportunity you had both been waiting for had finally arrived?" Chapter 11. The unravelling Dr. Armitage's face, which had been a pasty grey, suffused with a dark, angry red. "This is a monstrous fantasy. Beatrice and I, we were concerned for a sick man. That is the beginning and the end of it. To twist it into this is the work of a malicious, senile mind." But his protest, loud and blustering as it was, lacked true conviction. His eyes darted towards Beatrice, not with the concern of a doctor, but with the desperate plea of a co-conspirator. And it was Beatrice who broke. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a structure collapsing under an unbearable weight. The fight was gone, replaced by a devastating weariness. "It is no use, Robert," she whispered, not looking at him. "She knows." She raised her head, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and misery fixed on Miss Marple. "We were in love," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It is a sordid, common little story. I was a young, foolish woman. He was a kind man who paid attention to me. Alistair was my husband. He gave me this house. He gave me everything, but he did not give me affection. Robert did." Inspector Slack took a step forward, his notebook forgotten. He was no longer a policeman observing a suspect, but a man watching a tragedy unfold. "We were being patient," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining a frantic edge, as the words poured out. "We were waiting. Alistair was dying, you see. We knew it was only a matter of time. We told ourselves we were being honourable. We would wait until he passed naturally. We would not have to do a thing." She laughed, a thin, ugly sound. But Alistair was not a fool. On the night of the party, after everyone had left, he confronted me. I don't know what he saw, a look, a gesture, but he knew everything. Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. He was terrible. Not loud, not angry in his usual way. It was a cold, quiet rage that was far more frightening. He told me he was calling his solicitor first thing in the morning. He was changing his will. I would be cut off without a penny. Julian would be disinherited. Eleanor's legacy would be revoked. Everything, the house, the gardens, the entire fortune, was to go to a botanical research foundation. He was going to erase us all. The motive, stark and brutal, now lay exposed in the centre of the room. It was not about passion. It was about cold, hard cash, the loss of a fortune, the destruction of a future. "So, you telephoned the doctor," Miss Marple said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. "Not to calm your husband, but to tell your lover that the game was up. Your patience had run out." Beatrice nodded, tears streaming down her face now. Robert was waiting in his car, down the lane. He had been for hours. He came at once. He told me to go to my room and lock the door. He said he would talk to Alistair, reason with him. Reason with him? Miss Marple's voice was laced with a gentle, devastating irony. With what, I wonder? A medical bag, perhaps? A bag containing a solution he had already prepared, just in case patience was no longer a virtue. A solution of aconitine, extracted from the monk's hood in the garden he knew so well from his professional visits. All eyes turned to Dr. Armitage. He stood as if turned to stone, his face a mask of disbelief that his carefully constructed world was shattering around him. "He went to the study," Miss Marple continued, her voice painting the final, terrible scene. Alistair, perhaps feeling the strain on his heart after his rage, would have let his doctor in. And Dr. Armitage saw the glass of cordial Eleanor had left, a gift, an unexpected, perfect opportunity. He added the poison, and then he made his fatal mistake. She looked at Inspector Slack. He knew Eleanor's routine. He knew her connection to the cordial. He saw the little silver tray and realized it was a signature, pointing directly to her. In his haste to frame her, to make her the obvious suspect, he took the silver tray away and replaced it with a common one from the pantry. He wanted to obscure the personal nature of the delivery, but instead he left a clue that shouted his own ignorance of the household's ways. He overthought his crime. "And the bottle in Eleanor's room?" Slack asked, his voice hoarse. "A plant tonic, just as she said," Miss Marple replied. "One, I dare say, that Dr. Armitage himself had given her, knowing it was harmless, but knowing, too, that it would appear deeply suspicious if found during a police search. He was not just a murderer. He was a meticulous planner. He had his scapegoat prepared long before the crime was ever committed." Dr. Armitage finally moved. He took a step back, his eyes wild. "She is a witch," he rasped, pointing a trembling finger at Miss Marple. "She has twisted everything." But it was over. The logic was inescapable. The lies had been peeled back to reveal a core of pure murderous greed. Beatrice's confession had sealed his fate. Inspector Slack, his face grim, stepped forward. "Robert Armitage," he said, his voice cold and official, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Alistair Finch." As the sergeant moved to his side, Dr. Armitage seemed to crumple. The bluster, the professional arrogance, the lover's charm, it all fell away, leaving behind a terrified middle-aged man who had gambled everything on a poison culled from a beautiful flower, and lost. Chapter 12. The Quiet Aftermath. The departure of Dr. Armitage and a weeping, broken Beatrice Finch in the custody of the police did not bring relief to the drawing-room, but a profound and heavy silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind the chaotic wreckage. Julian had sunk into a chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The anger and resentment that had defined him for so long had been stripped away, leaving only the raw grief for a father he had never truly known, and a future that was now a terrifying blank. Inspector Slack, his official duties concluded for the moment, turned to Miss Marple. The skepticism was gone from his face, replaced by a look of grudging but genuine admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I owe you an apology and my thanks. I saw a neat and tidy case. You saw the truth. You saw the people." "Oh, I don't think an apology is necessary, Inspector," she replied gently. "You followed the evidence that was presented to you. It is just that so much of the real evidence is not in the things one can see and touch, but in the nature of people. It is so often the little inconsistencies of character that lead one to the truth." "The tray," Slack murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "It all came down to the wrong tray." "It came down to knowing that a person like Eleanor Vance, a person of quiet and affectionate habit, would not do something so out of character," Miss Marple corrected him. "Once you knew that, you had to look for the person who did not know her habits, the person who was an outsider to the heart of the house, even while he was a frequent visitor." She rose from her chair, a signal that her part in the drama was over. "You will see to it that Miss Vance is released immediately, I trust. The poor woman has suffered a dreadful ordeal." "My first call, madam," Slack assured her. "She'll be home before nightfall." Joan went over to Julian and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his face ravaged. "I was a fool," he whispered. "All those years, wasted on being angry. I never once thought." He couldn't finish. "Grief is a difficult country to navigate, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said from the doorway. "But you are young. You have time to find your way." As they walked out into the late afternoon sun, the gardens of Elderflower House seemed unnaturally bright, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness that had unfolded within the walls of the manor. Raymond West was quiet for a long time as they drove away. Finally, he turned to his aunt. "I don't know how you do it, Aunt Jane, truly. The police had facts, evidence. You had knitting, and stories about people in your village." Miss Marple smiled, a faint, wistful expression. "People are the same everywhere, Raymond, whether they live in a grand house like that one, or in a little cottage in St. Mary Mead. They have their pride, their greed, their little vanities, and their secrets. Dr. Armitage and Lady Finch, they thought they were being so clever, so patient. But greed is not a patient emotion. It grows and festers. They were like the ivy on the old church wall. Looks so very pretty, but underneath it is pulling the stones apart." She settled back in her seat, picking up the knitting she had brought with her. The needles began their soft, rhythmic clicking, a sound of comforting normalcy. The puzzle was solved. The dropped stitches had been picked up, and the pattern was once again whole. The quiet life of Little Hembury could resume its gentle, placid course, but it would forever hold the memory of the dark secrets that had bloomed and then withered at Elderflower House. Chapter 13. A House in Waiting. Eleanor Vance returned to Elderflower House in the quiet of the evening. The police car that brought her crunched softly on the gravel and departed with a similar discretion, leaving her standing alone before the grand Jacobean facade. The house, her home for so many years, looked alien to her, a place of shadows and terrible memories. Every window seemed like an eye, watching her with a silent, sorrowful judgment. She let herself in with her key. The great hall was silent, filled with the scent of old wood and beeswax, a smell she had always associated with safety. Now it only spoke of absence. She stood there for a long moment, a small, frail figure in the vast empty space, the ordeal of the past 2 days having stripped away what little colour she had possessed. A movement on the grand staircase made her start. It was Julian. He was coming down the stairs, not with his usual sullen stride, but slowly, hesitantly. He had changed out of his suit into an old tweed jacket, and he looked less like the resentful heir and more like a lost boy. He stopped on the bottom step, his face pale in the gloom. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "they told me you were coming back." She could only nod, her hand clutching the strap of her handbag. I am sorry," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. "For what they put you through, and for everything. I was a blind, selfish fool. I never saw what was really happening in this house. I never saw you." It was perhaps the first time in their long, shared history under the same roof that he had ever truly looked at her, not as a piece of the household furniture, but as a person. The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of past neglect. "It was not your fault, Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Wasn't it?" he countered, a flicker of his old bitterness returning, but this time it was directed at himself. "I was so busy hating him, I never stopped to think he was trying to do right by you at the end, and I was trying to steal from him." Later that evening, they sat in the small morning room, a place of chintz and faded sunlight, now lit by a single lamp. Mrs. Higgins had brought them a tray of soup and sandwiches, her face a mixture of pity and relief, and had then tactfully withdrawn. They were two castaways, adrift in a house that was no longer a home. The future was a great, unanswered question. The following day brought a visit from Mr. Abernathy, Sir Alister's solicitor, a dry, precise man whose calm demeanour was a balm on their frayed nerves. He sat in the drawing-room, a briefcase open on his lap, and explained the situation with methodical clarity. "Sir Alister did indeed telephone my office on Saturday evening," he confirmed. "He was in a state of considerable agitation, and instructed me to draw up a new will on the lines Lady Finch described. He was to come to my office on Monday morning to sign it." He paused, peering at them over his spectacles. "As he did not, and as the proposed new will exists only in the form of my preliminary notes, it has no legal standing. The current valid will is the one Sir Alister signed 6 months ago." He drew a crisp document from his briefcase. "Under the terms of that will, the house and the gardens, along with a significant trust to ensure their upkeep, are left to you, Mr. Finch." Julian stared at him, uncomprehending. "To me?" But he was going to cut me off. What a man intends to do in anger, and what he has legally committed to paper, are two different things, the solicitor said dryly. "The will makes provision for your debts to be settled from the estate. It also stipulates that a home at Elderflower House is to be provided for Miss Vance for as long as she so desires." He then produced another document. Furthermore, and separate from the will, Sir Alister established a trust fund in Miss Vance's name. It was finalized 3 months ago. He was a man who, in his own way, honored his duties. You are a woman of independent means, Miss Vance, A very considerable independence. Eleanor looked from the solicitor to Julian, her mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of the change. The fear of a destitute future, a fear that had been her constant companion for decades, was gone. In its place was a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. When the solicitor had left, she and Julian were silent for a long time. The house was his. Her future was her own. The old order had been swept away by a tide of violence and greed, and now, on the shore, they were left to build something new from the wreckage. "You will stay, of course," Julian said, his voice quiet. It was not a question. "This is your home." Eleanor looked around the familiar room, and then out of the window at the gardens, bathed in the soft light of dusk. For the first time, she did not feel like a poor relation, a guest on sufferance. She felt a tentative, unfamiliar sense of belonging. "Yes," she said, a surprising firmness in her voice. "Yes, I will stay." Chapter 14. The First Day. The morning after the solicitor's visit, a new and unfamiliar quiet settled over Elderflower House. It was not the strained, fearful silence of the past few days, but something else. A stillness of possibility. A blank page waiting to be written upon. For the first time, Eleanor Vance came down to breakfast not as a dependent, but as a woman of substance. And Julian Finch, for the first time, came down not as a resentful son waiting for his inheritance, but as the master of the house, burdened and sobered by the title. They met in the breakfast room, the same room that had witnessed the dramatic unravelling of their family's secrets. The air seemed clearer now. Mrs. Higgins had laid out a simple breakfast of coffee, toast and marmalade, and then, with a sensitivity one might not have expected, left them to it. "I walked in the gardens this morning," Julian said, breaking the silence. He looked tired, but the sullen anger in his eyes had been replaced by a thoughtful gravity. "With Gable, he showed me everything. The work Father was doing with the hybrid roses, the plans he had for the arboretum." He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. "I never knew. I never bothered to ask." "He loved his gardens," Eleanor said softly. "They were his life's work." "They were his legacy," Julian corrected her. "And now they are my responsibility." He looked across the table at her, his expression earnest. "I don't know the first thing about running an estate, Eleanor. I know about stocks and shares and how to lose money on them. But this—" He gestured with his hand to the window, to the sprawling green lawns and ancient trees beyond. "This is real. I'm going to need help." It was a confession of vulnerability, an admission of need that the old Julian would never have been capable of. In that moment, Eleanor saw the man he could become. The mousy, fearful companion began to recede, and in her place stood a woman of quiet strength. "Then we shall learn together," she said, her voice steady. "I know the household accounts, and I know the staff. Mrs. Higgins and Gable, they are the heart of this place. They will help us." And so began the first day of their new life. It was a day of small, practical things. They met with Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, not as master and dependent, but as a team, discussing menus and household supplies. Julian, to the cook's astonishment, asked intelligent questions and listened to her answers with genuine interest. Later, they walked the grounds with Mr. Gable, who, seeing Julian's newfound respect, opened up like a proud father, explaining the delicate art of pruning, the science of composting, and the long, patient work of cultivating a landscape. Julian listened, his hands in his pockets absorbing the lore of the land that was now his. In the afternoon, Eleanor found him in the one room she had thought he would never enter, his father's study. The police seals were gone, but the room still felt like a crime scene. Julian was not at the desk, but standing before the tall shelves of botanical books, his hand resting on a leather-bound volume. He read all of these, Julian said, his voice hushed. Every one. He made notes in the margins. He pulled out a book and showed it to Eleanor. The pages were filled with his father's sharp, decisive handwriting, arguing with the author, adding his own observations. It was a glimpse into a mind he had never known, a passion he had always disdained. He was a difficult man, Eleanor said, standing beside him, but he was not a simple one. No, Julian agreed, he wasn't. He closed the book and put it back on the shelf. I think I should like to read them. As evening fell, they found themselves in the drawing room, a fire lit against the chill. The house was still and peaceful around them. They had spent the day taking up the reins of their new responsibilities, and in the shared work, a quiet companionship had begun to form. The ghosts of the past were still there. The memory of a tyrannical father, a faithless wife, a greedy lover, but they no longer dominated the space. It feels strange, Julian said, staring into the flames, to have everything I thought I wanted, but to have it like this. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested, her voice thoughtful, you did not know what you truly wanted. He looked at her, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was genuine. Perhaps you are right, Eleanor, he said. Perhaps I'm only just beginning to find out. Chapter 15. A Departure. A week later, Miss Marple's bags were packed. Her visit to Raymond and Joan, which had begun as a quiet country holiday, had turned into something altogether more dramatic. Now, with the summer sun warming the flagstones of the terrace for a final time, a sense of peace had returned. The newspapers had had their fill of the Elderflower House tragedy, and the wheels of justice were turning, slowly and inexorably, for Dr. Armitage and Beatrice Finch. It is a sad business, Joan said, pouring her aunt a last cup of tea. But at least something good has come of it. I had a letter from Eleanor this morning. She and Julian are planning to open the gardens to the public next spring. They think it's what Sir Alistair would have wanted. How very sensible of them, Miss Marple commented, her needles clicking a slow, steady rhythm. A shared purpose is a great healer of wounds, and it will give them both something to do. Idleness is a great maker of mischief, I always find. Raymond, who had been quietly observing his aunt, finally spoke. I still can't get over it, Aunt Jane. The sheer cold-blooded nerve of it. Armitage planning it all so carefully. Using his medical knowledge, preparing the poison, setting up poor Eleanor as the perfect scapegoat. It's the kind of plot I might write, but to see it in real life. My dear Raymond, Miss Marple said, pausing her knitting to look at him, her eyes bright and clear. You novelists, you are so very romantic. You imagine a master criminal, a man of iron, nerve and brilliant intellect. But it is rarely like that. Dr. Armitage was not a brilliant man. He was a weak one. Weak? Raymond asked, surprised. He seemed so confident, so in control. Oh, that is the way of weak people, Miss Marple explained. They build a great wall of arrogance and charm around themselves, but underneath they are terrified. Dr. Armitage was terrified of being an ordinary, middle-aged country doctor. He wanted a grand passion, a great fortune. He saw Beatrice, and he saw Elderflower House, and his greed overcame his sense. He wasn't patient enough to wait for what he wanted, so he took a dreadful shortcut. She picked up her knitting again. He made the most common mistake of all. He underestimated his opponent, not the police, and certainly not a little old lady like me. He underestimated Sir Alistair. But Sir Alistair was the victim, Joan said, puzzled. Yes, my dear, but even in death, his character was the key. Dr. Armitage saw him as a simple tyrant who was universally disliked. He did not see the man who felt a deep sense of duty to his cousin, the man who was secretly proud of his life's work in the gardens. He thought framing Eleanor would be easy because he assumed everyone saw her as Sir Alistair did, as an overlooked dependent. He did not understand that Sir Alistair had a hidden, sentimental side, a side that was expressed in that little ritual of the cordial on the silver tray. He did not understand the man he was killing, and so he could not successfully imitate the patterns of his life. She tied off a knot of wool, her work complete. That is the trouble with wickedness, she said, more to herself than to them. It is always so very simple-minded. It never understands the complexities of goodness. The car arrived to take her to the station. As she stood to leave, she looked out one last time at the peaceful valley, the thatched roofs, and the distant woods. It was a picture of tranquility, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. But she knew better. She knew that the human heart was the same everywhere, in the quietest village as in the busiest city, and that its capacity for love, for greed, for kindness, and for murder was a mystery that would never truly be solved. "Goodbye, my dears," she said, kissing them both. "It has been a most interesting visit." And with that, Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked safely in her bag, departed, leaving behind a world that she had, with her quiet, unwavering understanding of human nature, set right again.